All right, so get ready because we're diving deep into a topic that's causing a lot of buzz in Nigeria right now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. President Tinubu's recent appointments. Specifically, we're looking at an opinion piece that's really stirring things up.
Hmm. Interesting.
The author is straight up accusing Tinubu of playing favorites, basically giving all the best jobs to people from his own ethnic group, the Yoruba.
Ah, I see.
And this isn't just some random blogger, right? This is sparking serious debate and raising some pretty big concerns about ethnic tensions, which, as you know, are always a sensitive issue in Nigeria. So I bet you're wondering, how are these appointments causing such a stir?
Yeah, fill me in. What's the author's main point here?
Well, they're saying that Tinubu is concentrating power in the hands of the Yoruba, like way more than we've ever seen before.
Really, more than ever before, even during military rule.
That's what they're saying.
Yeah.
And remember, those military regimes were often criticized for their own ethnic biases. So for this author to say that Tinubu is even worse, well, that's a pretty serious accusation.
Wow, strong words. And what kind of evidence are they using to back up this claim?
They go into a lot of detail, actually, pointing to all these key institutions like the police, the EFCC, that's the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, the DSS, the Department of State Services.
Oh, wow. So they're talking about the intelligence and security agencies.
Exactly. Even the Attorney General and the Chief Justice. So
Right.
basically, they're saying that Tinubu has stacked the deck when it comes to the criminal justice system.
Okay, I see where they're going with this. And what about the economic side of things? Any mention of that?
Oh, yeah. The author argues that key economic positions are also dominated by Yoruba appointees. Like they specifically mentioned the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria.
The CBN governor?
Yep, the finance minister, the minister of trade, industries, and investment.
Hmm. So they're saying Tinubu is putting his people in control of the money, too.
Pretty much. They're basically painting a picture of a government where one ethnic group holds way too much power. And they're not just talking about optics either. They're concerned about the real-world consequences.
I can imagine. Nigeria has a long history of ethnic tensions. When one group feels like they're being shut out, it can easily lead to problems.
For sure. And the author doesn't mince words when describing those potential problems. They use some pretty strong language, talking about things like corrosive suspicions, disenchantment, paranoia spreading throughout the country.
Wow, strong stuff.
Yeah. It's clear they believe these appointments are damaging Nigeria's national unity. You know, we're talking about social unrest, maybe even political instability.
Right, and when a country is dealing with that kind of stuff, it can really hurt the economy, too. Investors get nervous, development slows down.
Exactly, it's a whole chain reaction. So we've got concerns about ethnic favoritism, the potential for instability, and the impact on the economy. But then the author takes a turn that I honestly didn't see coming. They go out of their way to separate Tinubu's actions from Yoruba culture in general.
Oh, really? That's interesting. What do they say about that?
They really emphasize the positive qualities of the Yoruba people, describing them as inclusive, meritocratic, welcoming, tolerant.
Huh.
Yeah, they even quote someone calling the Yoruba champions of equity. It's like they're saying, hey, this isn't what the Yoruba people are about. This isn't who they are.
So they're drawing a distinction between Tinubu as an individual and the Yoruba people as a whole. That's a tricky issue for sure. I mean, can you really separate the actions of a leader from the characteristics of an entire ethnic group?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, on the one hand, it's important to avoid harmful stereotypes, right? You can't assume that everyone in a group thinks or acts the same way.
Absolutely. Every ethnic group is diverse. There's a whole spectrum of opinions and beliefs.
Yeah, right. But then on the other hand, Tinubu is the one in power, and he's making these decisions that are being perceived as ethnically biased. So it's hard to completely disentangle those things, you know?
I hear you. It's a complex situation. And it gets even more complex when you consider that the author isn't just criticizing Tinubu for favoring his own group, but also for appointing people who they think are just straight up unqualified, regardless of their ethnicity.
Right. Like they're saying, even if we ignore the whole ethnicity thing, there's still a problem here with competence and integrity.
Exactly. They argue that many of Tinubu's choices are simply unfit for their positions, pointing to allegations of corruption, lack integrity. You know, this ties into broader concerns about good governance and accountability in Nigeria.
For sure. And it makes you wonder, what's driving these decisions? Is Tinubu really putting the best interests of the country first? Or is there something else going on here?
Right. What's the motivation?
And that brings us to a really interesting point that the author makes towards the end of the piece. They suggest that Tinubu's actions aren't just about ethnic favoritism, they're about power. Like he's trying to build a dynasty, solidify his control.
A dynasty.
Yeah, and they even use this interesting Yoruba term, parapism, which on the surface emphasizes unity and solidarity within the Yoruba group.
I see.
But here, it almost feels like a critique. Like they're implying that this unity is coming at the expense of the nation as a whole.
That's heavy. It makes you wonder, is Tinubu's vision for Nigeria really inclusive? Or is he mostly concerned with his own power and legacy? And what does that mean for the future of the country?
Those are some big questions, and unfortunately, there aren't any easy answers. Nigerian politics is complex, and ethnicity is always a sensitive issue, but this opinion piece really shines a light on some of the key issues at play.
It's pieces like this that can really get people thinking and talking.
Yeah.
And those conversations are important even if they're difficult.
Absolutely. We need to understand these dynamics if we want to find solutions, and that's what this deep dive is all about. We're not just summarizing an article, we're trying to unpack it, explore the different perspectives, and hopefully spark some critical thinking along the way.
I like that. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and the sound bites. But sometimes you need to dig a little deeper to really understand what's going on.
For sure, for sure. And that's what we're doing here.
One thing that really struck me about this piece is how the author puts this whole issue of ethnic favoritism into the context of Nigerian history.
Right, like how they compare Tinubu to previous leaders.
Exactly. They argue that even during military rule, which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly known for being fair and balanced, we didn't see this level of concentration of power within one ethnic group.
It's a pretty bold statement, especially when you consider that they even bring up Buhari, Tinubu's predecessor.
Oh yeah, Buhari definitely faced his share of criticism for favoring the North.
But the author's basically saying that even Buhari's appointments, which, yeah, were skewed, weren't nearly as blatant as what we're seeing now with Tinubu.
Huh. It is kind of surprising when you think about Tinubu's background,
Yeah.
coming through the democratic struggle and all that.
Exactly. You'd think he'd be more sensitive to these issues, especially after fighting against oppression and advocating for a sovereign national conference, to address marginalization and all that.
Yeah, it's like the author saying, hey, this isn't just bad policy. It goes against everything you supposedly stand for.
Right. And they keep coming back to this word parapism,
Ah, yes. Parapoism.
which, as we talked about, emphasizes unity within the Yoruba group. But it almost feels like the author is using it sarcastically here.
Like, yeah, unity for the Yoruba, but at what cost?
Exactly. Like, look, we get it. You want to help your people, but this isn't the way to do it. This is actually hurting everyone, including the Yoruba in the long run.
That's a good point. And the author actually makes that argument directly.
Oh,
Yeah, they say that Tinubu's actions are actually counterproductive to the Yoruba people's own interests. That by creating this perception of Yoruba dominance, he's undermining the very values of inclusivity and meritocracy that they're known for.
it's kind of a paradox, isn't it?
Definitely. It's complicated, that's for sure.
Okay, but here's something I've been wondering about. The author claims that most Yoruba people are embarrassed by Tinubu's actions. They even say that the Yoruba didn't send Tinubu on this errand.
Hmm.
But how can we be sure that's true? Isn't it possible that lots of Yoruba people actually support what he's doing?
That's a fair question. And it's important to remember that this is an opinion piece, not a scientific study or anything. The author is giving their perspective, which might not be the same as everyone else's.
Right. I guess I'm just wondering, how should we, as readers, or in our case, listeners, how should we approach a claim like that?
I think it's about being aware that it's really easy to fall into the trap of essentializing entire groups of people based on what a few individuals do. We have to be careful about making sweeping generalizations.
That makes sense. So we can acknowledge the author's concerns without assuming they speak for all Yoruba people.
Exactly.
Right.
There's a huge diversity of viewpoints within any ethnic group. Some Yoruba people might strongly support Tinubu. Others might be really critical.
Right. There are always different sides to every story. It's never as simple as it seems.
Absolutely. And speaking of things not being so simple, this brings us to another important point the author makes. Even if we set aside the whole ethnicity question, a lot of Tinubu's appointments are questionable just based on competence and integrity.
Yeah, like they're saying, look, even if we pretend ethnicity isn't a factor, there's still a problem here.
Exactly. They basically say that some of Tinubu's picks are just straight up unfit for the job.
And they specifically call out his cabinet. They even say that it's still full of chaff, even after he removes some ministers who weren't doing well.
Oh, wow, they don't hold back.
Nope.
Yeah,
And they bring
great.
up these allegations of corruption against some appointees, even claiming that some of them are former governors who looted their states and are now trying to get immunity by getting appointed to national positions.
Hmm. That's a serious accusation.
It is, and it shifts the focus from just ethnic favoritism to these broader questions about good governance and accountability.
Right, because even if the appointments were perfectly balanced ethnically, it would still be a problem if the people in those positions were corrupt or incompetent.
That's their point, and I think it ties back to their earlier argument about Tinubu trying to build a political dynasty.
Oh, I see. Because if you're trying to consolidate your power, you need people who are loyal to you, not necessarily people who are the most qualified.
Exactly. It's like they're saying that he's not just appointing Yoruba people, he's appointing people who will help him stay in power and protect his own interests.
Hmm. And that's a pretty worrying thought, especially in a country with a history of corruption like Nigeria. It makes you wonder, if the author's claims are true, what does it say about Tinubu's leadership? What does it say about his vision for the country?
Yeah, it's definitely not a good look. So here we have this author who's really critical of Tinubu's appointments, saying that they're ethnically biased and bad for good governance. But they're also trying to draw this distinction between Tinubu and the Yoruba people as a whole. What are we supposed to make of all this?
Well, I think one of the main takeaways is that Tinubu's appointments have definitely raised some serious concerns about ethnic favoritism and what it could mean for Nigeria's unity.
Right, like, is the country going to become even more divided?
That's the worry. And the author makes a strong argument that these appointments are unprecedented in how much power they concentrate in one ethnic group.
And they raise these really important questions about whether Tinubu is truly committed to inclusivity and fairness.
Exactly. And then on top of that, there's the whole issue of competence and integrity.
Yeah.
Even if we ignore the ethnic side of things, some of these appointments seem questionable at best.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think about what good governance really means in Nigeria.
For sure. And I think the last thing to remember is that this is just one person's opinion. We have to be careful about taking everything the author says as absolute truth. There are always other perspectives out there.
Good point. It's important to keep an open mind and consider all sides of the issue.
Exactly. And, as we've been talking about all this, there's one thing that keeps coming back to me. The author mentions several times how Tinubu has put Yoruba people in charge of not just the criminal justice system and the economy, but also the security apparatus.
Oh, yeah, I noticed that too.
And that feels really significant. Like, what are the implications of having one ethnic group in control of institutions that have so much power, especially in a country like Nigeria?
Yeah, it's like they're highlighting this pattern, right? They point out that the heads of the army, police, customs, immigration are all Yoruba. And then they specifically mention the DSS too. It's like, wow, that's a lot of control over institutions that can use force. And, in a country with a history of ethnic conflict, that feels, I don't know, kind of risky.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It definitely raises some questions about, well, potential bias, right? And whether those institutions could be used to, maybe suppress dissent or even target other groups.
Exactly, that's what I was thinking. And remember all that strong language the author used, like disenchantment and paranoia, deepening of ethnic cleavages.
Right.
It's like they're warning us that this concentration of power in the security forces could have real consequences. It's not just symbolic.
I think you're right. They're suggesting that this could actually destabilize the country. And it makes you think about, the average Nigerian on the street.
Right.
How does this make them feel? Do they feel safe? Do they trust the government?
Those are good questions.
Right.
It's a big deal. Okay, but let's just play devil's advocate for a minute.
Okay.
Couldn't someone argue that, maybe Tinubu is just choosing the most qualified people for these jobs and it just so happens that they're Yoruba?
Sure. Someone could definitely argue that. And the author even acknowledges that the Yoruba are a very capable group.
Yeah.
But they kind of push back on that idea, saying that, the gap can't be this wide. Like, statistically speaking, it seems unlikely that the best people for all these positions would just happen to be from the same ethnic group.
Right. It does make you wonder.
It does.
And that's where that whole thing about Tinubu building a dynasty comes back in, doesn't it? Because if you're trying to hold on to power, it makes sense to have loyalists in control of the security forces.
Exactly. It gives you a way to, enforce your will and potentially silence any opposition. That's why the author's point about abuse of power is so important. Because if these institutions aren't seen as impartial, if they're seen as serving one group over others, then people lose trust in the government. And that's when things can start to get really unstable.
That's a scary thought. And it makes me wonder, what happens to Nigeria if this keeps going? The author almost seems to be saying that the country could fall apart if things don't change.
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. Although, I mean, there are a lot of factors that will determine Nigeria's future. It's not just about this one issue.
True.
But the author's warnings are definitely something to take seriously. I mean, they're raising valid concerns about what could happen if one group is seen as having all the power, especially within the security forces.
Yeah. And it's not just about perception, is it? The author actually says that in the third world, people know ethnic domination when they see it.
That's a good point.
Like, this isn't just some theoretical debate. It's about real people and the risks they face if the institutions that are supposed to protect them are biased or corrupt.
Absolutely. The stakes are high. And the author seems to be saying that Tinubu is either oblivious to those risks or, even worse, that he's deliberately using them to his advantage.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. And it all leads up to that final question that the author asks. Why is Tinubu hell-bent on this primitivity?
Right. It's a question that makes you stop and think. What is motivating him? And what does it mean for Nigeria?
It feels like the author is leaving us with a challenge, to really think about this whole situation and what kind of leadership Nigeria needs to move forward in a way that works for everyone.
I agree. This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground. We talked about the concerns surrounding Tinubu's appointments, the potential consequences for Nigeria, and those big questions about governance, representation, and ethnic tensions that the country's facing.
And it's given us a lot to think about, hasn't it? But that's what's so great about these deep dives. It's not about giving you all the answers. It's about encouraging you to ask the right questions and explore different perspectives.
For sure.
We've gone beyond the headlines and really dug into the nuances of this complex situation. And hopefully, as someone who follows Nigerian politics, you've come away with a deeper understanding of what's happening and the challenges that lie ahead. So, yeah, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.